Good morning, everyone. I'm Dan Fitts, and I'm the Executive Director of the Adirondack Research Consortium. I'm pleased to welcome you to our second program in this fall's webinar series, Impacts, Threats, and Opportunities. This series will continue the next 2 Fridays in October, and I hope you're able to join us. I want to thank Paul Smith College for partnering with us to bring you these webinars, and Price Chopper's Golub Foundation for sponsoring today's program. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. If you want to talk to each other, please use the chat function. We welcome your questions. We'll get to as many as we can, and those that we are not able to will be posted later online. These programs are recorded and posted on the ARC's YouTube website. Today's program focuses on the human dimensions of natural resources. Today's panel includes Dr. Kim Coleman, Assistant Professor at the Center for Earth and Environmental Science at SUNY Plattsburgh, and also a board member of the Adirondack Research Consortium. Dr. Abbie Larkin, a research consultant for the design firm Otak. Abbie is also an ESF alum and a longtime friend of the ARC. Jillian, a graduate student at the Center for Earth and Environmental Science at SUNY Plattsburgh, and Luke Briccetti, also a graduate student at the Center for Earth and Environmental Science at SUNY Plattsburgh. We will begin our program with Dr. Coleman. Kim?
Thank you so much for having me and for having this panel. I'm really thrilled to speak with you all about human dimensions of natural resources and sort of all the range of work that happens. Not the full range, but some of the range of work that happens within that discipline. So as Dan said, I'm Kim Coleman. I'm an assistant professor in the Center for Earth and Environmental Science at SUNY Plattsburgh. And I'm really interested in landscape level natural resource planning. And so that looks different in different contexts. And I'm just going to share a couple projects that we're working on now, and then hopefully there'll be that will just spark some questions. So just a really quick slide about me. I did both my undergraduate and my master's at the University of Vermont, so really rooted in the Northern Forest region. And then I left and went to Virginia Tech, and then returned back to the region to start my career. And so I'll just tell you about a couple brief projects, and Luke and Jillian are both my graduate students, so they'll go into more depth about some of them. So one project that we have going on is really, as I said, I'm interested in landscape level planning. And so in Altona, New York, some of you may know that there's a fire adapted ecosystem up there, the Altona Flat Rock, that burns periodically. And of course, it exists in the middle of a town with homes and businesses and a maple sugar operation. And so one of our research projects and the work that we do is thinking about the eventuality of a next wildland fire and how we get communities to plan and prepare for that. So really thinking about what the ecology is of that place, and then what human decision-making looks like in that area, and trying to encourage people to enroll in things like Firewise, a program to make your land more ready for fire, thinking about management of the forest itself and sort of all the decision-making that goes into preparing for the eventuality of the next fire. Another project that's quite different on the next slide, really thinking about the increase of mountain biking that we've seen as a result of COVID. So mountain biking was becoming increasingly popular in the Northern Forest region before COVID. And then, people were looking for ways to recreate outside safely away from crowds. And this gave way to what we're terming, or what a lot of people are calling, the bike boom. We really have questions about, what does that mean for natural spaces, for forests, particularly in the Northern Forest region. So this is work that is funded by NSRC, which is, a branch of the Forest Service. And we're really just trying to understand what does this mean, these human use patterns on the landscape. So again, this nexus of ecology and human decision making. And then another even different project, Luke is going to talk about this one in more depth, but really trying to understand, because the Northeast is so made up of, there's so much land that's held privately, and that the management of that land has a range of conservation implications, right? And so trying to think about how forest landowners make decisions and understand what drives those decisions and what that means for a range of conservation issues. In this case, water quality in Lake Champlain Basin. Again, I won't get too much into how we're doing this because Luke's going to talk about it. And then the last project I'll tell you about also, I won't get too much into depth because Jillian's going to talk about it, but really looking at how to diversify the field of natural resources broadly, but in specific, thinking about how to get more Black, Indigenous, and people of color, particularly at the high school level, engaged in watershed science. And again, thinking about like, what are those human social factors that drive career choice, that encourage people to want to go into the field of natural resources, or that keep people out and that discourage people. So all of these projects, you know, the through line that connects all of them is that we're really interested in thinking about what drives decisions around natural resource management, what drives decisions to go into careers in natural resources, and sort of what are the socioeconomic conditions or characteristics that lead people to those decisions. And that can help us figure out what the leverage points are to enact change, either within our field of natural resources or across the landscape. So with that, I'll hand it over to Jillian, and she's going to share a little bit more, and then I look forward to answering questions at the end.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Coleman, for that introduction. My name is Jillian Cara, and I'm currently Dr. Kim Coleman's graduate student in the Natural Resources and Ecology major at SUNY Plattsburgh, where I also received my undergraduate degree in environmental science. And I have a broad range of interests, including environmental justice, environmental planning, environmental literacy, and creating equitable environmental education. So you might be wondering, what is environmental literacy? We could segue to the next slide. Environmental literacy, also known as EL, is defined in environmental education literature as having four main components. And these components are knowledge, affective attitudes, so think feelings about nature, cognitive skills, and behavior. You might be familiar with the term environmental knowledge, but it's really only a small component of environmental literacy. Environmental literacy drives the importance of individuals understanding their impact on the environment, and it involves action, critical thinking, communication, responsible consumerism, values, and beliefs. So historically, programs designed to increase environmental literacy have predominantly served white individuals, excluding people of color. And this is known as procedural injustice, where educational programming is not arming individuals of color with the knowledge required to participate in planning, management, and decision-making processes. And with climate change, deforestation, and many other natural resource crises occurring, there is an increasing need to create an environmentally literate society that is prepared to address demanding and emerging environmental issues worldwide. So we can segue to the next slide. And however, there exists a pervasive perception of environmentalists as white, upper middle class, politically liberal, and college educated, and the environmental workforce is predominantly white. So further environmental initiatives such as sustainable development often reinforce inequalities, and this lack of inequality in the environmental movement is unethical, and it often limits opportunities to leverage diverse perspectives and experiences. Thus, there's a need to create an environmentally literate society that includes rather than excludes Black, Indigenous, people of color. And this ties into BIPOC engagement in watershed science, where we can introduce natural resources and other areas of environmentalism to our youth through educational interventions and implementations. So we could jump to the next slide. So this summer, we actually implemented 3 educational interventions related to watershed science at the Upward Bound programs at SUNY Plattsburgh and the University of Vermont. So you could see the 3 different pictures. I absolutely love them. So moving from left to right, the first image shows students at SUNY Plattsburgh catching and IDing macroinvertebrates. So students geared up in waders and net kick to capture their own samples, and they ID'd the macroinvertebrates and calculated the pollution tolerance index, also known as PTI, of the Saranac River. And students at both Plattsburgh State and the University of Vermont participated in interactive watershed scientist panels, where scientists from diverse backgrounds got to speak with students, explain their careers, career paths, while answering students questions related to higher education and even high school. So this was really a chance for students to interact and engage with watershed scientists, seeing a broad range of opportunities and jobs available. And then the third intervention that we implemented was painting a rain barrel. So again, students at both Plattsburgh State and the University of Vermont painted rain barrels. And during the activity, students learned what stormwater is, how soil absorbs runoff, and how vegetation can slow down, spread out, and act like a filter, and improve the importance of having stormwater infrastructure in our communities. And in order to access these interventions, equitable survey tools were created. So we could jump to the next slide. So some recent bodies of literature suggest that there are differences in environmental stewardship, connectedness with nature, and environmental career aspirations based on racial demographics. And while not all research regarding these topics are biased, using bias survey tools will produce biased results, rendering these findings invalid. And it's for this reason that we created an equitable survey tool through the lens of critical race theory and excluded questions related to environmental knowledge in order to assess these categories in an equitable manner. So in order to minimize potential bias, we also excluded questions that asked individuals to self-report environmental behaviors because, let's be honest with each other, if someone asked if you recycle or if you turn off the lights when you leave a room, you're going to say yes because it's the right thing to do when trying to be environmentally responsible, but you might not actually do it all the time. So for our ongoing research, we focused on three categories that I previously mentioned: stewardship, connectedness with nature, and environmental career aspirations, in order to see if there are any correlations between stewardship and connectedness to nature, leading students to pursue environmental careers. And at this moment in time, the data indicates that while our students respond highly to stewardship and connectedness with nature, there's a disconnect for students pursuing environmental careers. And this research is currently ongoing, but we can see that it's because there's a lack of representation within environmental jobs and organizations and a lack of culture that they see fitting. So this research is still ongoing. So if anyone is interested, please ask any questions. Thank you.
All right, so I'm also one of Kim's grad students. My name is Luke Briccetti, and my project is pretty different from what Jillian is working on. And I'll just give some background as to me and why I got interested in this project. So I am currently, for my master's thesis, focusing heavily on the management of road crossings in the Lake Champlain Basin. And before I was a grad student, I worked for 2 years in planning at the Northwest Regional Planning Commission in St. Albans, Vermont, which has jurisdiction over Grand Isle and Franklin counties in Vermont. So I did a lot of land use planning and water quality, transportation planning, and a lot of what I focused on was road culvert replacements. So I was working with U.S. Fish and Wildlife and other organizations like in the Lake Champlain Basin Program, for example, to prioritize culverts to be replaced based off of flood risk or water quality concerns or fish passage. And this was on public town roads, and then trying to raise funds, write grants, and get these culverts replaced with better ones. And while I was doing that work, I from sort of the project development side, I got to understand a little bit more what the gaps were in this type of work, and what data we needed to have a better idea of which culverts needed replacing. So so on the next slide, so you can see here on the left, Lake Champlain Basin and its land cover. So the basin is 66% forested, and you can see in the Adirondacks, it's even more forested than on the Vermont side, which has more valley. And so in the forests of the Lake Champlain Basin, there's a lot of private land with industry. So there's maple sugaring on both sides of the basin, as I'm sure you all well know, as well as logging. And both of these industries require private roads to get people and equipment in and out in order to do that important do their work and manage the forest. So we know that there are private roads crisscrossing the landscape, but we really have no data on where these private roads are, where the road crossings are, and how they're impacting the landscape, and how landowners are viewing their own roads. So the main research questions, if you want to advance to the next slide, Abbie. So the main 3 research questions that I'm interested in are, where are these private forest road crossings? Are landowners addressing the road crossings? And how are these road crossings impacting streams? And so the first aspect of this that I have been contending with is how to identify where these crossings are. So which is difficult, because there really isn't private road line data out there for our area. So we don't really know where the roads are. So how are we going to identify where the road crossings are? And the method I've been using is digitizing these crossing sites using high resolution LiDAR topography data. And you can see up in the upper left-hand corner what that high resolution topography data looks like. So you can see, this is an image of a road crossing, and you can see the road sort of moving. You can see sort of the flattened surface of the road, and then you can see sort of a river valley, and you can see the road flowing over the river valley, which indicates that there's a culvert there to get the water across the road. So using this method, essentially, we've been able to identify about 700 crossings in the Lake Champlain Basin. And moving forward, what we did is we took the parcel data and the landowners of these crossings, and we emailed them a survey. So Abbie, if you want to advance to the next slide. We emailed our landowners a survey with a QR code so that they could fill it out online if they wanted to. And the goal of this survey was first to get a better idea of what landowner perspectives and attitudes are towards the road crossings. So we were asking them questions like, do you feel like you have the financial capacity to replace this culvert if you needed to? Do you feel like you have the personal capacity to do so in terms of time and energy? Would you consider replacing a road culvert for something other than flooding, right? If you found out that this culvert was impacting water quality negatively, would you want to put your time, energy, and money into replacing it, or is that not worth it for you? So these are the types of questions that we were trying to get at. And then we also use these surveys for another purpose as well, which was as recruitment for field assessments. So we basically asked landowners whether they'd be willing to allow students access to their land in order to do further assessments. And then sort of the last part of this as well is outreach. So this we haven't gotten super into yet, but we plan on doing. So we're going to be working with some local organizations, such as conservation districts, watershed organizations, my old planning commission, to contact, first of all, to help contact landowners who may have pre-existing relationships with these organizations, and also to help us organize some sort of in-person engagement events. So one idea that we've had is to bring, as part of existing, forestry programs, to bring landowners out on private roads and have a discussion about best management practices in person. So that's some of what we're also using the survey mailings to do. And then the last aspect of this, if you want to advance to the next slide, is field assessments. So like I said before, we use the surveys to ask landowners if they'd be willing to let us assess their culverts for fish passage, and also to assess other aspects of stream characteristics such as fish abundance. So one of the things that we were conscious of is making sure that landowners are aware that we are researchers and we are not interested in regulating culverts, and because that's a big worry, is people thinking, well, that they're going to come look at my culverts and they're going to share this with the DEC, and I'm going to have to replace my culvert, which is not at all our intention. And I think something that's helped with building trust with landowners to allow us to go on their land and to do these surveys is getting fish data as well. So there are questions of how are these culverts impacting fish populations, which is why we're doing it. But it's also, I think landowners like knowing a little bit more about, the fish communities on their land. Yeah, I think there's something to be said for, ooh, cool, this is the fish community around my culvert, and this is how many, and it seems like the brook trout are doing well, and there's this many big ones. And so I think that is a benefit of doing this type of integrated work. And then I might have one more slide. I think I do. Yes. Okay. So the last thing I wanted to say is that the reason we're doing this and sort of the overall relevance is first to fill the data gap in terms of private roads in our study watersheds, and then to better understand forest landowner behavior, and specifically behavior regarding crossing management. So better understanding how, what the perspectives and attitudes of landowners are towards their road crossings. And then lastly, I'm hoping that this could provide a blueprint for similar projects in the future, both within the Adirondacks and Lake Champlain Basin, and also beyond, because this type of work really hasn't been done anywhere. So it could be applied more broadly to other parts of the U.S. and the world. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to Abbie for the last few slides.
Thanks, Luke. Hi, everyone. My name is Abbie Larkin, and I'm a research consultant at Otak, which is a firm that has specialized expertise in engineering, landscape architecture and design, architecture, water and natural resources management, and further specialized expertise in visitor use planning and management. I have featured the amazing team that I am a part of, which focuses on visitor use planning and management at Otak. And as a team, we are all PhD and master's level social science researchers, but we represent a range of backgrounds in the social sciences, including the human dimensions of natural resource management, resource economics and policy, political science, conservation, psychology, economics, and we all have a strong quantitative background as well. Otak as a firm is interdisciplinary, as I said. It's based on the West Coast, but we do have a small East Coast presence, including myself. I work at a home office out of the state of Vermont. And we work with a variety of federal clients, particularly the Park Service. And we as a visitor use planning and management team work a lot with the Park Service and other managers of protected areas and parks. So I titled this slide Expectations versus Reality to try to set the scene for where we do a lot of our important and interesting work. These two images contrast. The one on the left paints a picture of what maybe many visitors, not all visitors, may expect to experience in a park or protected area. They get to be in this beautiful place, see the grand views, the extraordinary natural setting, and they hope to be there with their own visitor group or alone, or at least with a low density of other people around them. But instead, visitation levels in many parks and protected areas are increasing to the level of the image that is on the right, where we have high levels of crowding and concentrated visitor use. And these types of settings can have negative impacts on the visitor's experience. They potentially pose safety risks on this particular trail where it's narrow and passing people in two directions can be quite challenging. And this level of visitation may in fact impact the natural resources which these landscapes have been established to protect. This is a space that we operate in as visitor use planning and management specialists. We provide data-driven bases for understanding visitor use levels, patterns, experiences, and preferences in order to inform planning and management, and we leverage our social science backgrounds to do so. We tend to describe our work in terms of two phases. The first provides descriptive information, which in and of itself can be extremely useful for supporting visitor use management planning and strategies and developing and informing key decisions. Descriptive information takes the form of providing information on visitor use volumes and patterns, how many are there, where are they, what are they doing, how does their use distribute across the landscape. This information also documents the extent and types of visitor use impacts and can speak to the relationships between visitor use and impacts. Here I'm showing in the graph some data that were collected, which represent the number of people in one space at a time. And the tall bar represents the range of counts within the hour of the day, and the orange circle is the average value for that hour over all the days where we collected data. And the picture just shows the place where we were collecting data. And you can see from the graph, we're describing that pattern over time. And the takeaway message is that in the morning, there's a range of people at one time in this space, but it is much higher in the morning than through the afternoon. You can see that that curve sort of levels off. This can be really important for managers to understand when use levels tend to be high, when they tend to be low, and how they distribute. A second phase of work that we develop is an evaluative phase, where we not only have our descriptions of what is happening, but we collect information that can speak to the effects of impacts on the quality of the visitor's experience, or the level of support or opposition for different management actions. We can also collect information on visitors' opinions about different management trade-offs. So here you're seeing, layered on top of that descriptive information from the previous slide, a dashed horizontal line. And that line was derived from visitor preference surveys, where visitors to this place were asked about degrees of crowding and given photos that simulated different numbers of visitors in this space. And they were asked to report whether the amount of people in that photo would make them feel crowded or not crowded. And from that, we were able to derive one of a series of analysis thresholds to compare against current conditions. So this threshold represents a certain number of people in this space beyond which the majority of visitors reported that they would feel crowded. So it gives you a lens to then evaluate what is happening on the landscape. And this can all be used to inform important management decisions. We use a variety of tools from the social sciences for both the descriptive and the evaluative phases of our work. And I've listed a series of those tools and provided some images that represent us using those tools on the landscape or our screenshots of data. We use these tools and apply them after we have developed the primary research questions along with our clients. We select the best tools with respect to the question, and then we develop the study design and implementation, analyze and model the data, interpret and report on those results for our clients. So we're frequently using surveys, as I'd mentioned on the previous slide. We also deploy a range of equipment to count visitor use and provide estimates of visitation. We conduct a lot of spatial data collection, analysis, and modeling, and also combine our data to perform statistical and simulation modeling. We're frequently integrating transportation and visitor use analyses as well, because in parks and protected areas, movement of visitors is often very much tied to the transportation network. And a lot of the levers we might pull to manage visitor use and provide for an improved visitor experience are related to the transportation system. We also conduct qualitative interviews and focus groups. And I have worked with Kim Coleman on a project in the past where we leveraged our qualitative interview skills. And then we also work on technologies related to emerging technologies that measure visitor use mobility, which include primarily passive mobile data. So these are data that are collected passively, mostly on folks' smartphones by way of apps that are sharing your location information. And from that, we can get a great sense of the visitor movements across time and space that we can't otherwise get during a field-based study. And the images on this slide show us in the field conducting interviews and surveys with visitors on the top left, conducting training with park staff on the top right, deploying equipment on the bottom left, and then a view of a screenshot of passive mobile data on the bottom right. And I've shown a lot of examples from some national parks if you've been reading the captions on the pictures, but I want to emphasize that we have worked across the national park system. We've worked with US Forest Service units as well. But recently in 2021, we had the opportunity to work with the Adirondack Council and launch a descriptive phase of a work for the Adirondack High Peaks region, in which we were able to collect some important information to present a baseline view of visitor use levels in the High Peaks region, which was really exciting for me personally, having studied the Adirondacks for my graduate work. And we hope to continue to work in this and other landscapes under our visitor use planning and management team. So that's the end of the slides we've prepared to provide an introduction on each of us and the type of work we do. And I think now we're ready to transition and focus on the Q&A part of this panel session. We have a question in the Q&A, Kim, about the references Robin Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass book. The question states, to walk the science path, I had stepped off the path of indigenous knowledge. This is a quote from Kimmerer's book. Is this indigenous knowledge a part of any of your courses, such as reading Kimmerer?
I can take a stab at that first. So I don't have students read Kimmerer, but I do teach an environmental justice course, and we do read works by other Indigenous scholars. And I would say that in the research context, this question comes up a lot with regard to, particularly with regard to planning for wildfire and the way that especially public land is managed to protect against the risk of catastrophic wildfire. So in lots of study sites that I've worked on outside the Adirondacks and in the Intermountain West, where there's a lot of proactive harvesting of trees and prescribed fire to reduce fuel loads, that happens on ceded land that was historically Indigenous land that Indigenous people continue to have use of for spiritual and cultural reasons. And so the cultural and spiritual uses of those lands sometimes comes up against the science, which is, I think, what Kimmerer is at here, right? That sometimes like the way that we manage with modern ecological thinking sometimes butts up against traditional uses of the landscape. And so one example is like not letting Indigenous folks smoke oak trees because there needs to be a different management pattern that's like written into a forest management plan. So I think that concept comes up a lot, and I do try to integrate that into my classes and my teaching. And then in the Altona project right now, we are definitely trying to make some connections with the community, the Ganyanka community up there, to sort of understand if they had historic uses at that forest. So that's a long way of saying yes. And those were the examples that came quickly to my mind.
And to also quickly go off of that, I know in our population and community ecology class at SUNY Plattsburgh, students do actually read that book. So to go off of Kim's yes again, yes.
So feel free, everyone, to post questions to the Q&A. Questions can be related in general to the topic of the human dimensions of natural resource management, or specifically to any of the projects or types of work we each presented.
So since there's no open questions right now, Abbie, I have a question for you. How did you get into your job? Your job just sounds amazing. How did you get into that career? Can you tell us a little bit more about it, please?
Sure. My job is pretty exciting. It's pretty special and unique. There aren't a lot of recreation science departments across universities. In fact, ESF had a dwindling one when I was a student there. I'm not sure the current status, but it wasn't a very well emphasized program at that time. But I took as much as I could from that program and others across ESF, which provides a lot of interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary opportunities. And I was focused on the Adirondacks as a landscape, which has a very important recreation component to it. And I was really interested in how do we provide information to decision makers for complex protected areas like the Adirondacks, and how do we engage variety of stakeholders in those decisions. And I spent a lot of time in the Adirondack landscape, seeing some issues firsthand, and then experiencing them from a professional perspective as a student. And then I branched out into national park settings and started to think about how are these issues and questions thought about and addressed on the national park scale. And then one thing led to another, and I'm from Ohio, so I had family there send me an article about this research consultant who was doing a project to understand visitor use in the Cuyahoga Valley National Park. And that researcher happened to be Steve Lawson, who is my current director. And so I connected the dots and kept an eye on that firm, applied for a job, had the right skills, and have been there since. But I would say that our team is pretty small, as I showed, and we each bring something pretty unique and important to the table, and we're able to work very efficiently as a team with our skills to work across a variety of projects and address a lot of really interesting and important questions for the Park Service.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
I see a question in the chat about the methods that we're using in the mountain bike project. And so I can answer that one. So we actually are going to have 4 phases of research. One is concluded. So the first phase is a systematic lit review, looking at anything that's been written about mountain biking in natural resource, recreation, tourism, literature. That paper is in review now. The second sort of phase and method is really looking at a scrape of social media, and we're targeting Twitter for that, although there's some bumps coming up in the road on that one. And so, but that will be a qualitative analysis using machine learning. We have a computational scientist with the US Forest Service that's part of the team on that. So really just looking at like, what are folks talking about when they talk about mountain biking, especially what has changed over time as the bike boom has happened. Are we seeing mentions of conflict between user groups? Are we seeing differences in geographic area, clustering around specific trail networks, et cetera? We'll then be doing a content analysis of news stories specific to the Northern Forest region. That will be carried out by another graduate student who's not on this call today, or soon to be graduate student that's not on this call today. And then she'll also do work in specific communities, focusing on Bike the Borderlands, which is a network of trail towns that's facilitated by the Northern Forest Center, sort of across the region. We're omitting the community in Quebec, and looking on the ground to see sort of like what impacts people are seeing, talking to shop owners, talking to trail managers, and that field work will be carried out next summer. So some of the specific methods to be diffused, sort of scaling methods, beginning from this big systematic review, a little bit smaller social media, a little bit smaller regional content analysis, and then the really site-specific work. So we hope to have some results of that maybe the end of next summer to share with folks, and the systematic lit review hopefully will be out before then.
I'll also add that we are hosting what we're terming as a listening session next month to get a better understanding of how we're hoping to hear from people involved in local organizations with large mountain biking trail networks nearby as to how the increase in demand for mountain biking has impacted the community, both in terms of like community cohesion and just like generally the positive and negative impacts both of how mountain biking is impacting sort of the social landscape of smaller, of more remote communities. So if anyone is interested in attending that, you are welcome, and definitely let me know in the chat, and I could send you an email with some of the info on that.
Abbie, I think some of these other questions are good for you, but there's one that I think we can all answer about analytical skills. So I'll do the analytical skills question, then maybe I'll hand it to Abbie and she can answer like 3 of these questions. So I am really interested in mixed methods and integrating across different sort of different scales and different methods types. And so I really encourage students to put as many tools in their analytical skill toolbox as possible. So definitely statistics, if you have the option to take a qualitative research methods class, if you have the option to take a mixed methods research class and you can learn a little bit about how to appropriately and effectively mix methods from different paradigms. And then I think GIS and spatial tools are increasingly important. And the more that students can sort of think creatively about like, okay, how do we integrate qualitative research with GIS or qualitative research with statistics, I think that's really critical. And I'm hoping maybe Abbie can speak a little bit more about the practicality of that, because I know that they use a range of analytical skills.
Yeah, I can speak to that. And I could also emphasize, like we as a work group, we tend to think about these places as complex systems. So any type of tool or approach that applies systems thinking, because natural resources are inherently connected to our social structures for managing them, using them, experiencing them, enjoying them. And so it's very challenging to effectively manage if you are managing in isolation. And unfortunately, many of our managers are brought up within a discipline that they have such a focus, but we need a broader perspective within natural resource management that connects the different disciplines and perspectives and looks across them, because in places like the Adirondacks and others, even some of these communities, we have folks who are using the resource and the landscape to mountain bike, but they're having an impact on the nearby communities. They're also having an experience while they are there. So it's a multidimensional focus on natural resource management. And so combining these skills is really important. I would say on our team, it's really important to have the quantitative hard skills to process the data and draw insights out of the data we collect. It's also important to be able to think creatively about the right kind of data and the right kind of approach to ensure that you're able to address the key research questions. And I would put in a plug for learning some kind of coding software. We use R across our team, which is not something that was extremely common when I was in grad school. I was lucky enough to take a class on it, and it has set me off in the direction that I am in today. And I use it almost daily, I would say. And it's pretty fundamental to how we're able to streamline and process our data and verify and QA/QC what we're doing along the way. So definitely emphasize that.
I'd also say as a current grad student that the things that you're mentioning of like R and like spatial skills, like working with ArcGIS, are super important. And I would suggest going beyond just like whatever the intro level class is. And like maybe like, for example, with ArcGIS, like maybe, you know, a lot of people take the intro class. So maybe taking the intro class and then taking a higher level if that's offered, or trying to do an independent study to get a little bit more experience with it can be useful, so that you're maybe a step above your peers and being able to, you know, utilize those skills.
Yeah, I just want to reiterate that again, especially like when looking at jobs and stuff, a lot of people are asking like, oh, like, do you know GIS? Like, do you have GIS skills? Do you know GIS Pro? So really having some knowledge on that, and even getting the ESRI certifications to show like, hey, like I can work with like this, like, and this and this. It's really beneficial.
So there are some questions specifically addressed to me that I think I can run through, but if anyone else wants to tag on to whatever I have to say, you're all more than welcome. I'm going to start with the last one first. The question was posed, Abbie spoke about the social impacts of visitor use, whether visitors perceived a location to be crowded or not. Do any of you research/have projects about how visitor use impacts other resources? So I can speak from my team. We do tend to focus on the social side of visitor use, but many of our projects do look at the connectivity between levels of visitor use and impacts to the natural resources. It's not a focus of ours and it's not a specialty of ours. We have some very skilled recreation ecologist specialists that we will work with when that's a key component of a study. And we need to bring them in and consult with our thinking on how the pieces fit together on a landscape and what are the known or anticipated impacts based on different levels of use. We do bring in experts for that type of work. But it's also the connections between different levels of visitor use and direct impacts to resources are a little harder to define than the impacts to the visitor use experience and the social impacts, because it's not as much a one-to-one as you saw where we can plot a horizontal line, and above this point, there are impacts beyond what we would accept, just due to the relationship that is a little more tenuous and harder to define between use levels and impacts to natural resources, considering the historic levels of use and amount of use across the landscape as well. All right, so I'll move on to
that,
oh, yeah, go ahead.
I just was going to add, we're not here yet with the mountain biking project, but I do have hopes and dreams of maybe trying to write a bigger grant to look at some of those questions, really thinking about maybe how impacts compare to other uses if they're concentrated by different types of riding. But I think we're some time away, baseline information from this first grant first. Sorry, Abbie, go ahead.
No, that's fine. I think part of our work is focused more on the impacts to the visitor experience, in part because that's our discipline and that's mostly what our work is focused on. But also to have visitors in a space, there is a known and direct impact. It's already there. We already have trails, we have mountain bike use. There has been impact to that resource, and it's because use is already on the landscape. And so the challenge is to then quantify additional levels of use and their impact to a resource which is potentially already hardened or cleared because the trail is already there. So it's a little harder to get at than some of the other work that we do. So now I'm going to go to another question. I was asked to speak a little bit more about the study in the Adirondack Park High Peak Zone, which was the last slide of my presentation, and how some of the points in my presentation are being applied in that study. So I can clarify that again, was focused on the descriptive phase, so not reaching into the evaluative phase at all. That may be a future next step for that landscape, but we were able to collect some important baseline information on levels of visitor use using trail counters at the Adirondack Lodge and other access points into that primary high peak zone. We monitored roadside parking along the Adirondack Lodge Road. We conducted patrols that simulated a hike, and then documented the number of groups that were encountered along that hike, and use those to estimate levels of intergroup encounter, which relates to whether or not visitors are able to experience some degree of solitude based on the amount of other people that they're encountering along the way. And then we also collected, on top of some key summits in the high peaks, counts of visitors at one time, like you saw in the graph in the presentation, to get a sense of the number and density of visitors up on some key high elevation summits. And then we looked at the statistical relationships between the number of people up on top of those summits, the number of encounters along trails, roadside parking, with the number or with the level of visitor use according to the trail counters, just to see what those relationships were, if they were strong, and if you'd be able to then use the count at the trail counter to predict conditions within the system. And all of that is important for describing baseline use levels in the landscape, but can then be used by managers to make some next level decisions about that space.
Any other questions for us? So somebody asked about the term replication crisis, and I wonder if it's possible for that respondent to describe, or that person to describe if they're referring to the need for replication or the issue of like competing studies. I'm just watching the Q&A. Well, I'll just say I'm not totally sure what the person who posed the question was wondering about, but I think definitely from a methods point of view, I worry a lot about triangulation, and I worry a lot about looking at the same question from different angles, which is, I think, one reason that I'm interested in using mixed methods. And so certainly one thing that I'm very interested in is attacking the same question from different levels of analysis, different scales of analysis, and then in different research paradigms. And so as a result of that, I'll tend to collaborate with scholars across a range of disciplines. So just as an example, the mountain bike project has 3 co-PIs that have different disciplinary expertise than I do. And then in terms of replication, thinking both at those multi-scalar levels that I described, but then having the community work in multiple communities across the Northern Forest region. So really this question of like triangulation, making sure that it's the studies can be repeated so that future researchers can replicate it and then look across a range of studies for meta-analyses, I think is really critical. And it's also one of the things that drove us to do a systematic review as the first step in that research, to see what had been done more broadly and take sort of the lessons and the framework from that broader work to frame and use as a foundation in our work. I'm just going to look again to see if there's yes, that multiple research studies, primarily in relation to psychology and medicine, are unable to be reproduced. So yeah, so I think this is totally, what I'm getting at. If we are able to attack it from multiple scales and multiple research paradigms, and then triangulate, then we can have more confidence that that those results are valid, right? If they're sort of like convergence. But then, yes, I agree that like replicating in multiple communities is definitely a reason that we're looking across communities in the Northern Forest region, and having colleagues across the country trying to do the same work in different communities can both find patterns, similarities, and replicability, but then also nuance within communities, because of course that's going to exist as well.
Just to follow on Kim's point, we often look for convergent validity or triangulation in the data we collect for a study, such that we model different aspects together and confirm if we receive approximately the similar estimates based on the different inputs. And then otherwise, I would say we do a lot of work that's very context specific, and so we don't expect that it will generalize across different parks and protected area. Each one of the areas where we work has a lot of unique qualities, unique opportunities, recreation destinations, and visitor bases that we would not expect that, for instance, a crowding threshold from one landscape applies to another. We would reconduct that study specific to that other landscape.
Luke, I don't know if you see this question, but someone is asking you if you can maybe just describe how you identified your culverts. It was in the 2 sample watersheds, yes. And maybe you can they want to know if you taught GIS to do it.
Sure.
Or if you, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so just to repeat the question, it says, yeah, it is a good question. Luke, you mentioned identifying 700 culverts on private land. That's a lot. Was that in 2 sample watersheds or the entire Lake Champlain Basin? And did you manually search and identify each of those or teach a JS program to do it for you? So that was just in this again shows sort of the magnitude of the problem that I was discussing a little bit, because that was just in the 2 sample watersheds that I mentioned, of the Lamoille watershed in Vermont and the Ausable watershed in New York. And I did manually search and identify each of these. Now, I did make it a little bit easier on myself because I used GIS to select parcels that I was expecting to perhaps see road crossings. So though I was only looking on forested land, I was only looking on privately owned land. I was able to, I had a system set up, a little bit of a grid system, so that I could systematically work through these areas without repeating myself and at like maximum efficiency. And I did have streamlines as well, so it wasn't like I was just aimlessly scrolling through a landscape. I was seeing, okay, this is a parcel, this is a stream that runs through the parcel. I'm just going to scroll up the stream and look for an area where the road crosses the stream. So that's essentially how I did that. It was tedious. It did take a long time. Maybe not, honestly, not as long as I thought it would. It was a reasonable thing to do. It wasn't an insane amount of work, honestly. And I did think about doing some sort of supervised classification or something along those lines to automate this. And that's what I was at least hoping to be able to do in the future. But after discussing this with some people who are a little bit more GIS, I talked to a professor at UVM who runs the spatial analysis lab there, who has a lot of GIS experience, and he basically told me that the amount of time that it would take to try and train an algorithm to do this, especially at the scale that I was looking to do it, which is just some watersheds in the Lake Champlain Basin, it would not be worth it would be a lot faster just to do it manually. And I think he was right. But if this was to be applied to, it is definitely something that would be really useful to do eventually if you at a much larger scale. So if for example you were trying to do this over the entire northern forest region, which is like upstate New York through Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, if you were trying to do that entire area, then maybe some sort of classification system would make sense. But just based off of having to troubleshoot it and accuracy and all that, digitization was sort of the move for me personally.
Thank you, Luke. I'm going to jump in here and sort of wrap up. If there are more questions anyone has for us, please submit them to us and we'll answer those and post those answers on our Facebook page. Recordings of this presentation can be found on our YouTube channel, and links to both of those can be found on our ARC webpage, adkresearch.org. I want to thank our panelists for excellent presentations, Dr. Kim Coleman, Dr. Abbie Larkin, Jillian, Cara, and Luke Briccetti. Excellent job. Thank you. I want to thank Paul Smith College for partnering with us on these presentations. And I want to thank Price Chopper's Golub Foundation for sponsoring this program. I want to thank our president and ARC president and Paul Smith College professor, Dr. Melanie Johnson, for providing the technical expertise that make these programs possible. I ask that if you're interested to tune in the next two Fridays, next Friday we'll be looking generally at the topic of heavy metals on forests. And our final program is on the history and evolution of agriculture in the Adirondacks. We'll be shifting away from webinar presentations in November. On November 3rd, we're holding our Fall Forestry Roundtable in partnership with Empire State Forest Products Association. That program will be held at SUNY Adirondack. It's an all-day event, and we'll be covering topics such as biodiversity and forest management, the latest on the forest inventory and analysis, and the Climate Smart Commodity Project. And information on that program and how to register for it can be found on our website, adkresearch.org. And finally, I just want to mention, we are a not-for-profit. We ask you to consider supporting our work with a tax-deductible donation. And you can find out how to do that by going to our webpage at adkresearch.org or contact me directly, and I'm happy to help you out. We appreciate your support of our work and our efforts to bring science and information to inform policies impacting the future of our region. Thank you again for an excellent presentation, and I wish you all a good day.